My guest today is Cornelia Baines, Professor Emerita from the University of Toronto. Cornelia has many talents. One of them is playing Beethoven at a high level. And this is not what we are going to discuss today. We are going to discuss if you think women should attend mammography screening. And I'm pretty sure that the paper you published in 1992 about the Canadian National Breast Screening Study is what has made you most famous. And people still talk about your study 31 years later. So please, Cornelia, welcome. And can you start by saying, what did your study show?
Well, let me begin by saying that the study caused an uproar because it did not reveal what had been hoped for. It did not reveal a mortality benefit from screening. That is, it did not reduce breast cancer deaths in women who were screened with both mammography and clinical breast exam compared to women who just had normal community care in Canada, which is pretty good. Age 40 to 49, no benefit from combined screening. For women aged 50 to 59 who were screened, there was, again, no benefit. Now, this was after 7 years follow-up, which is not a very long time to be analyzing breast cancer deaths. But those results really should not have been a surprise.
Oh, that's interesting, because there were some earlier studies, one from New York and one from Sweden, the two-county study that had shown a reduction in breast cancer mortality of around 30%, and you found nothing.
Well, there's a big difference between us and Sweden. Sweden didn't do clinical breast exam. We did. Sweden couldn't tell you anything about the participants in their trial other than their age at entry. Our control patients were followed as assiduously as our intervention patients. And the most interesting thing about all that is that the tumor sizes that we discovered in women in both age groups was much smaller than was observed in the Swedish trial, which would indicate two things. Either our mammography was better or the population health status was better. And we know nothing about the health status in the control population in Sweden, which was the population with which the comparison was being made. Whereas in our study, we knew as much about the control population as we knew about the study population.
Yes. And in 1999, I was asked by the Danish National Board of Health to review the mammography screening studies. And it was very easy for my statistician and me to agree that the Canadian trial was one of the best ever performed in the world. But you did not get the result people hoped for, and then started all your trouble immediately.
You know, Peter, I have to mention now that I was privileged to review the paper that you published, and I just was jubilant when I read it, because by that time I had been accused of being a murderer. This is another feature of the publication of the two-county Swedish trial, which I should mention. After our results were published in 1992, the Swedish investigator, who shall go nameless, was interviewed by Science, one of two foremost science publications in the world. And it was an interview. And he said, and I quote, "We're not in the business of murdering women," because horribly, in our trial and in others. Initially, there's an excess mortality from breast cancer in women who are screened, for which there are explanations, but none of them totally convincing yet. Now, our study also showed excess breast cancer mortality in women 40 to 49 in the early years after screening started. So when I had observed that phenomenon as we were collecting our results, and Dr. Jabbar in 1985 published in Lancet exactly the same finding, I was naive enough to think, oh, we're both the same. He'll never criticize us for that. But I was wrong, because when we published our 7-year results, he told Science, we are not in the business of murdering women like the Canadian study is. I wrote a nice letter, a brief letter to Science, pointing out the misjudgment in that statement. And miracle of miracles, my letter was never published. And I had similar experiences with other errors that were published in radiological journals, and the journals would never publish corrections. So that's the way of the world. If you're telling lies people want to believe, as Mr. Trump so famously does, you will be believed.
This is one of the things that I will tell people about in my podcast series, that we have an unusual amount of censorship, even in our best medical journals, and you have just illustrated that. So you have been on a very long journey where you have faced that you could not publish even corrections when people had published or said something in interviews that were wrong. So can you tell us something more about what then happened in the following years?
Well, I would say that in the 32 years, or actually it's 33 years now. No, it isn't. It's 31 years since we published our 7-year results. I have never stopped being harassed with personal emails, personal telephone calls, and most lately, I think it has migrated to what is currently called gaslighting. The things that have been said about us are so totally false. For example, it was said frequently in the United States that women in Canada had to come into our trial because otherwise, if they had a lump in their breast, they couldn't get a mammogram with our terrible healthcare system. Well, of course, the truth of the matter is no woman had to come into our study to get a mammogram if she had a lump in her breast. As I was practicing medicine in the 1980s, I could order a mammogram for any woman with a breast lump that was concerning. We were told, or the public was told, that in our study, we did not even have mammography units. We were using ordinary examining tables such as you see when you go down and lie down to be examined in a radiological unit. No mammography units. And we were criticized even by radiologists in Canada who should have known better. The extent of the lies has been formidable, and there's no way you can really counteract them, because if they are feeding a belief system that people are committed to, they're going to believe it. More recently, I have heard that I want to call it a cabal of international radiologists who want the Canadian National Breast Screening Study to be totally ignored. tried to have our Canadian task force on preventive medicine dissolved because it did not agree with them about screening guidelines. Well, that didn't get anywhere because the federal government, even if it had wanted to, apparently cannot close it down. It's on. And what most people may not know is that the Canadian Task Force is the predecessor of the US Preventive Services Task Force. And they thought it was such a good idea. They were established. They've been working ever since. And of course, when in 1991 or 1992, they came out not approving of screening for women in their 40s, there was a release of outrage, which is indescribable, beautifully described by Suzanne Fletcher in an article in Annals of Internal Medicine as an Alice in Wonderland sort of event that was quite incredible. The endless propagandizing and political pressure, it is extraordinary how successful it has been. But now that we see how successful Mr. Trump is, we realize how vulnerable the public is to misinformation when it supports their own belief system.
Yes, could I add here that I have seen meta-analysis reviews of the screening trials that omitted the Canadian trials because they had been so heavily criticized, ignoring totally that the Canadian trials were the best at the time, together with a trial from Malmö in Sweden. So this illustrates the extent to which people are prepared to be totally unscientific and violating basic scientific principles. And the irony in all this is that it doesn't matter if you exclude the Canadian breast screening trials from a meta-analysis, because your bottom line is the same, that you don't save any lives, because women don't live longer if they go to screening than if they don't go to screening. The total mortality is the same. Even the total cancer mortality, including breast cancer mortality, is the same, whether we include your trial or not. So it's what could you say? It's bogus. It defies reason.
Two things. I have to resurrect the name of Brian Cox from New Zealand, because in the wonderful 1992 consensus conference sponsored by the United States National Cancer Institute, he did a blind review of all existing screening studies at that point in time. And he came to the conclusion that you have just espoused. There was no benefit to be received, and there was certainly no flaw in the national study, our Canadian study. Indeed, it was the best or one of the top best. So it's fascinating. Evidence has been consistently ignored. But Peter, if I can interject at this point, when I was thinking about this interview, I was thinking there are three nouns that characterize the history of screening, and perhaps evoking them will make us understand better what has been happening historically. And the three words were hope in the 70s and 80s, fear in the 70s and ever since, and conflict of interest, which has really become paramount now with the multiple imaging techniques that have been superimposed on film screen mammography and now yield billions of dollars annually to one sector of the universe. I began with hope that was initiated with the New York health insurance plan screening study that was published in the late 60s. And this led to hope. Hope because they did observe a decrease in women 50 to 59. They did not observe a decrease in women 40 to 49. Then began the stimulation of fear, which was manifested by ads even in the New York Times, but elsewhere generally, very, very small ad, a public service announcement. If you're 35 and haven't yet had a mammogram, you need more than your breasts examined. What a demonic ad to run, and how effective it was. All right. So the hope also led to good things. It led to what I consider to be a rather stupid waste of money, the Breast Cancer Detection Demonstration Project, which ran, I'm not sure when it started, but it was running through the 70s. And the idea was to screen as many women in the United States as possible and learn more about breast cancer. But because it was a demonstration project and it wasn't a scientific trial, it was very difficult to get conclusions from it. So by the end of the 70s, the United States National Cancer Institute, along with the American College of Radiology and the American Cancer Society, plus sundry Canadian organizations and individuals, decided to examine the evidence that existed at that time and design the trial that really needed to be done. So they came up with the Canadian National Breast Screening Study, and it specifically addressed two things. One, the economic status of two countries, the United States and Canada. Could they really do a large trial with 100,000 women, a trial of the efficacy of screening in the United States with its wonderful healthcare system? Or might it be a little bit less difficult to conduct it in Canada with our universal healthcare system, meaning that if women had an abnormal screening mammogram, they could go and get investigated and treated without any personal cost?
Could I say a few things, Cornelia, about the New York study, which was the first screening study of all studies? That when we went through this study, we found it to be unreliable. The two groups were not comparable. We suspect that more women with breast cancer were excluded from the screen group than from the control group. And also, it's unlikely they could have found such a big reduction in breast cancer mortality at that time, also when you consider the tumor sizes and so on. So there are many problems. But I would like to... problems. Yeah, I would like to...
Peter, what you have to recognize is that when this group of experts were meeting to decide what needed to be answered, they did not know that, and they assumed that the results were valid. Yeah. So we're talking about the state of knowledge in the 70s, not now.
Yeah, but it's not only you who have been seriously harassed. As you know, I have also been terribly harassed, and this might be the biggest scandal in the Cochrane collaboration's history, that I published a Cochrane review of mammography screening in 2001 with my statistician, and the Cochrane breast cancer group refused to publish our data on overtreatment, that too many women had cancer detected and had breasts removed or lumps removed. And it was in the protocol they had themselves both approved and published. And I had to work for 5 years making complaint to the Cochrane steering group before the Cochrane breast cancer group finally had no other choice than to publish our data on the harms of breast screening. So this is another thing. This is also a story that needs to be told, that even in the most of idealistic organizations, you can meet very
corrupted. And this is my third noun, conflict of interest. And that comes
yes.
much later. We're now trying to understand how the screening universe has unfolded. And one of the things I'm trying to address is the many criticisms that are directed at the design of the study, which are quite presumptuous and usually quite stupid.
These old stories cannot make mammography screening effective. And mammography screening has many harms. Overdiagnosis, that healthy women get a cancer diagnosis they would never have gotten.
That's the last stage of the story, because we talked about hope and fear, and generating fear in the public has been a major mover of screening uptake. You make people terrified of breast cancer, which they did. You do surveys of women and find that they think breast cancer kills more people than cardiovascular disease. You find also that they think more people die of breast cancer than get breast cancer. And it's demonstrating the buildup of a population that is ripe to be misled. And then you come to conflicts of interest, which is what you're talking about. And this is ultimately very successful, because the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force has just endorsed screening in women 40 to 49. So life is very complicated.
All right.
Not a straight center is answer, Peter, but I won't surprise you doing that.
We will need to finish before long, but I have one final issue that you hear very little about. And this is that the more you go to screening, the greater the risk that some radiologist thinks that you might have something and call you in for a new investigation 6 months later or whatever. And it is actually so common that in the United States, where they are more aggressive, up to half of the female population that attend screening, they get a false positive diagnosis or a suspicion of cancer, and they are recalled for further investigations. And then
conflict of interest.
And then some of my colleagues in Denmark did a study on the psychological consequences of fearing that you have cancer. And even 3 years after these women had been declared cancer-free, you are absolutely,
they're still worried.
You are absolutely healthy. They had a level of worry that was between those who had never been told there was any suspicion on a mammogram and those who had been told they had breast cancer. So if you factor all this psychological distress into the equation, and also consider that you don't live longer if you go to screening, and more women lose a breast if they go to screening, that has been documented. I have enormous difficulty seeing that there is only one thing that would be honest and good for women, that is to stop mammography screening in the whole world. That's my conclusion based on the science. Do you disagree with that?
I think it would be ideal if we were implementing measures to improve health that were effective. And I think the promotion of mammography is tragic. And in the world that we live in, nobody can declare the end to anything. You just have to hope that people will become rational enough to review the evidence and make a decision appropriate for themselves.
That's correct. And I can give you an example. When I had finished my studies and wanted to get a summer job, I went to Carlsberg, the Danish brewery. to earn some money, but I was not allowed to work there before I had been X-rayed for tuberculosis. And we have not had tuberculosis in Denmark for 10 years, when they were still requiring workers to get an X-ray of your lungs for tuberculosis. What you just said is so true. That how can you ever stop things again? That's very difficult.
It appears an insurmountable task, and one just has to hope that sooner or later truth will dawn in the minds of the majority of people.
Yes, I think we should finish on that note, Cornelia. And I want to thank you so much for having contributed to this.
It's interesting.
Thank you a lot, Cornelia.
You're most welcome, Peter. Bye-bye.